Not again, not again, not again. Hello and welcome to the Exploding Appendix podcast. This episode is the second in a two-part series of discussions with Yasmin Nair. In part one, we discussed against equality hashtag activism and Black Lives Matter. In this episode, we will turn to topics of class, polyamory and love. The session was recorded on the 30th of June 2020 as part of the Exploding Appendix Avant-Garde Art Practice and Research Group, which meets fortnightly to discuss a range of topics loosely related to the history of the avant-garde and radical culture. The episode also includes audio from Valentine for Perfect Strangers by Brooklyn Feral Cat on YouTube. A link to this video and further reading relating to the podcast can be found in the description. As I've already in the previous episode introduced this session, I think it's over to Yasmin and the discussion of class.
I would love to talk about class in the UK versus class in the US.
I've done philosophy and politics for a long time, and I've been bothered about poverty or people struggling, but I've never thought strictly in terms of these class ideas until very recently, until this pandemic, I think, really. And I think that what's really interesting about the UK is class was so important. It was the fundamental thing for social movement in the UK, and it was what people spoke about. And that has been lost in so many different conversations, and you can see traces of this class stuff. So I was watching, I don't know if you've heard of him, a guy called Tommy Robinson, who ran the EDL. So it was the English Defence League. So he's a very right-wing guy.
We have to say Tommy. Tommeh. Tommy, not his real name. A complete fucking fake.
No. He's got a far posher name than that. But he came from Luton and also from a bad area, and was I think that went through some pretty bad stuff. But then has gone to prison, and he's a very racist, divisive figure in the UK. And I was listening to a speech that he did to the Oxford Union about explaining why he came to the positions that he came to, why he came to these racist anti-immigration. And I think that there's a real shame in British culture that we are trying to be divided along boundaries of things other than class now. So we're dividing identities in terms of North and South in particular, which was previously a class divide because it was poor people in the North versus rich people in the South. And also, I think that so many issues to do with renting in the UK, which are specifically class issues, we don't talk about in terms of class. No one goes, oh, this is, poor, underprivileged people. There's just traces to that heritage. And I think that this is the time to bring it to bear, because it's made me, the last few weeks have made me so conscious of it and made me so angry of the way that social strata move and how industry moved, because in a way we've been blind to this kind of movement. And I've always focused in my life on things like LGBTQ rights. That's been the really, really important movement that I've wanted to follow in people should be able to express themselves. But when you look at it more, the capitalist culture of the UK is kind of quite open to this. You should be who you want to be. But it's more class where you're going to struggle if you're a poor queer person, I think.
Just a couple things. The debate on mutual aid versus the debate about explicitly messaging. That's something that I've seen in the U.S. left for quite a while. You get like Trotskyists and Marxists saying to the IWW, and the IWW is setting up like free food tables next to prisons or jails. Like, why aren't you giving the messaging? And so there's this perpetual debate. Mutual aid or propaganda. And people on the anarchist side tend to be on the mutual aid side overall. And people on the Marxist side tend to be more into propaganda, especially Trotskyists. But regarding class, I think in the U.S. that you're seeing within identity circles that there's this internal class politics within identity, which is being borne out more and more today. And I think there's a huge discussion of racial capitalism today, more than for a long time in the mainstream. For a long, and in academia, there's this discourse simmering from people like Angela Davis, who started out really radical and then went liberal, about racial capitalism, and it was simmering for probably decades, and now you're really getting, I'm seeing more African American folks, more Black folks talking about class openly, talking about Karl Marx openly than ever before. And so I think in the U.S. you really see certain movements affiliated with identity that take on a class strongly, almost like subtly, or as a class, within their identity politics. And so that, because the US has been doing that slowly over the past, say 20, 30 years, the UK may need to do that again, which is to re-inject class into all of these divisions that are manifesting, and I think that is a huge thing in these debates between mutual aid and, propaganda, is that, there's accusations about which one is the more bourgeois thing. Is it more bourgeois to expect propaganda with your free food, or is it more bourgeois to keep politics out of services? And that's a perpetual debate I've seen among leftists.
One of the things I was thinking about with class, and this idea of, somebody mentioned renting, what I've noticed is, and it really is from the 1980s onwards, this idea that somehow to be in a council house is a very sort of negative thing. Whereas when I was growing up before the 1980s and the 1970s, council housing was really the kind of thing most people wanted to get into. Right. They wanted to get out of the private landlords, because private landlords was expensive and there was no real regulation of the kind of quality. And, people lived in social housing, and it was so much better. And I think it was the Margaret Thatcher thing that basically makes us rethink about class. And we almost have two systems. We have the old sort of landed, sort of titled class system, epitomized by the Queen and all of that, but we also have a kind of property ownership class. And and that kind of, I think that is really up for debate at the moment, as to whether or not actually we need to rethink how we actually sort of address property ownership, because I don't think it happens in Europe to the same extent. I don't know what it's like in the US, because housing is really expensive here. I live in social housing. I'm very conscious of what people think, and you can be in a conversation and people will say something and you think, oh, okay. Right. And so we have cities like Milton Keynes. I mean, Milton Keynes has got a policy of building a mix of housing in every kind of new development.
Right, and that's also sort of technically the policy here in a city like Chicago, for instance. I think what you're calling mixed is exactly what, whenever there's rampant gentrification, they always sort of paper it over with, we'll have mixed income housing. But what they define as the defining income is something like, $200,000, right, a year. So then affordable housing becomes, let's say, a quarter of that, which is not necessarily poverty level and so on. So there are all these weird ways in which we fudge around housing. Housing in the US is of course not considered a right at all. So yeah, there's all of that.
This is not the Star Trek we asked for. Housing should be a right.
Right, exactly. But Anna, so thank you for that. And what you and Harvey and others have said about class in the UK, or class, in Europe, is really interesting, because class works as a part of American consciousness, works very differently. And I apologize, by the way, if I know I'm one of those ugly Americans who keep using the term UK and Britain and England very interchangeably. I apologize for that. I am aware of the differences, but I'm just not used to, conversing about them so much. So I apologize. But let's just say European ideas about class, and for that matter, Asian ideas about class, which I'm very familiar with, coming from India, where I think one of the reasons the British Empire succeeded as much as it did is because it came across the elites in India and said, well, ta-da, you too have an amazing class structure. Let us collude and, demolish everyone else. And we were like, oh, yes, we get it. We get hierarchies, we get class structure. But I think Americans have in their DNA, in the social and political DNA of the United States, class is supposed to be something that just doesn't exist, or that you can attain in very particular ways, so we have, for instance, the robber barons, we have this idea that class is something you gain with like a monogram. If you get enough monogrammed napkins, you've got class structure. But I think if you were in the UK, it's very difficult to make your way into a class structure. Perhaps less so now, I think, after Thatcher. Certainly less so after Blair, right? For instance, neoliberalism has made it easier to acquire a certain class status, perhaps, right? Perhaps. But it's still very much entrenched, it seems to me, within, who are you really? Where are you from? Where's your family from?
Do you get that a lot in America, Yasmin? Because your accent isn't exactly American.
Yeah, you got a little bit of British bourgeoisie.
And I heard South African as well, I heard Southern Hemisphere briefly.
Yes. It does. My editor at Current Affairs, Nathan Robinson, has had similar sort of. Nathan's actually, his parents migrated from England. Nathan's a character, and anyway, there's a whole thing about accents as well, right? Like, how do you speak? And then what you said about the guy Tommy, and the ways in which this working class accent has become, sometimes it seems to me, right? If you have a working class accent, you have a weird kind of cachet in certain points, right? And sometimes you don't. But accent has become the signifier of weird things that kind of slips and slides around. Did you speak? Anyway, you know what I mean, right? Because you guys get the whole accent class thing.
We have My Fair Lady, where you detect the exact London belle from the accent. Of course we do.
What region are your people from, etc. But I think in the US, class is not what Zara was talking about, which is that the way the left approaches class has a lot to do with the left's reluctance to think that class does exist and that it does, in fact, mobilize people's lives, right? In a way that I think my British friends tend to understand very well. My Indian friends understand perfectly well. My American friends are all like, no, that doesn't happen. But it does, but in different ways, right? So that's why in the left, for instance, you have a lot of people with a lot of money in the left in the US. They're the ones who own the left magazines. They're the ones who own the nonprofits, right? They're the ones who run things, but they all pretend to not be from a certain upper class background. So they all do the whole tame, they all do the whole accent thing.
I find that it's a very strange phenomenon because I don't know exactly why Americans might have this position that class doesn't exist, because so I did a talk like a month back, and one of the things that I mentioned during it was John Dos Passos's book USA, which is like a fragmented narrative and lots of biographies and newsreels about American life, and it's very, very focused on the idea of class emerging as a phenomena in the US. And it was a hugely successful book at its time. And even if you look at things like, okay, Moby Dick, maybe not so much, but even then you've got these idea of social strata emerging. So at what point did it become submerged beneath different rhetorics? When it wasn't, I don't think it was always something as, right. It wasn't something always invisible.
I would say probably around the time I don't know, I'm just guessing here, but I'm guessing that the point at which the United States became a country that really relied upon its urban centers as its, the composite of which would become the face of the US. I think that sort of the intense move towards urbanization as an ideal, which also meant the suburbanization, following the 1940s and 50s, meant so everything became an offshoot of the urban. I think that's the point, because the urban represented a place where you could disappear your class origins in the US, just as, once upon a time, you could disappear your class origins, mythologically speaking, you could disappear your class origins in the Wild West.
Yeah, for sure.
No one knew who you were. No one knew where you came from. That was the Wild West. And the urban centers, I think, San Francisco, which also then is integrated with queer identity, right? The formation of a certain queer identity, for instance, in cities. You get New York City in particular, Philadelphia, Chicago. All of these sort of urban areas become America, as it were, right? In the way that America sees itself. And that becomes a place where your class origins get wiped out. You can reinvent yourself, right? You get the urban conglomeration, etc. So I suspect that it has a lot to do with that, is my guess. And it also would explain why the United States to this day, despite the enormous subsidies, for instance, that farmers, certain kinds of farmers have received over the decades, despite all of that, the United States treats its non-urban areas really badly. I mean, for instance, most people don't know this, but in the US, people outside the major cities have terrible Wi-Fi access. I mean, access to Wi-Fi, which in many countries is considered a human right, increasingly. Access to Wi-Fi is really difficult if you're not living, for the majority of people in the US. Most people don't know that, and they would be astonished because richest country in the world. But that's how badly, like resources, library services, transportation funding, all of that is really awful if you're outside urban centers. So I think class then, gets rejiggered, as it were, within the urban centers. And class then becomes something that you don't admit to, because after all, you're living in a city and the obsession is with pretending that you come from nowhere, but you are someone. And this is sort of the thing that you see in Hitchcock, you see in television shows in the 90s, for instance. Friends and all of those shows are all about, you kind of enter a city and then you reconfigure your class status quickly.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was about to say that I think that for a long time in American history, other things have been proxies for class. I think, again, race is often a proxy for class. Religion, types of Christianity, that was often a proxy for class, right? Certain for Christianity were viewed as lower class, and certain ones were, and also your immigrant community was viewed very much class-wise, the immigrant community that you associate yourselves with. So, European Jews have a class association with wealth, whether or not that's true. It has somewhat true in many places, where immigrants from South America have an association with a lower class. So I think that there's a lot of things that are proxies, and I agree about the urban versus rural thing, and I think that the suburbs are also a place like the cities where there's this idealized version of the suburbs that lets people shed their class status. I grew up in this town called Newtown, Connecticut, which was the place where the school shooting happened that a lot of people heard about. And there were a lot of people there who had their families had lived in Connecticut and for a long time, but then when New York City became this financial center, Wall Street, there was a lot of rich people that moved to Newtown because it wasn't too far from New York City, and so it became this funny mix of everyone that said they were middle class, but I said in high school there was 50% white trash and 50% rich snobs. So it was this funny place where people were disappearing their class status through this idyllic picture of the nice little Stepford Wives Connecticut town, Stepford Wives suburb. So I think the disappearance of class, it happens in many different forms in this country. But yes, there's a lot of proxies for it, and there's a lot of terrains where people can mystify its existence.
Yep, exactly.
Do you know, I was having a weird narcissistic daydream today where, because I've been thinking so much about what it might mean to have a revolution, I think that there's one phenomenon in Britain, that angry working class males in Britain provide this violence which is threatening to the state, and the state don't really know how to deal with it. And I was thinking about there is a way that you can link the struggle of a lot of people that they almost directly oppose together, like through a trajectory of historical materialism, right? Through saying that this thing happened here and this created this, and the division has come later on. So there is something that you're united on. So I just had this narcissistic daydream that I was delivering a speech to a group of EDL members, just saying, like, we're actually on the same kind of side here. And I wonder if the same could apply to the way that Americans think of as freedom, as this freedom from something. And it reminded me of the Sacco and Vincetti case, the two anarchists that were executed by the state. And in a way, the way that a lot of people on the right of American politics engage with ideas like we need more autonomy, we need the state to be less, is a basic form of the same anarchism, which was really radical in saying we need to set up our own communities in a certain way. And whether that could just be a useful tool for actually suggesting that there could be another way of talking and doing politics in a way that united people that seemingly were at odds with each other. Because if you think about it like in terms of like a coercive thing, the left needs to bring people to its side in order to gain power. It doesn't work we're not going to sustain ourselves by just sitting within our groups and saying we need to do this. We need to find ways of enticing people to understand the point of view in which we want to create change. And maybe this sort of harking back to the anarchism that has created this same kind of rhetoric, it would be a useful way of engaging with people who seem politically opposed to you.
Sarah?
I mean, I'm part of the IWW, which is exactly that. It's an organization which it was restarted in the 1990s, and you know its original history is from 100 ago, the 1920s. So I mean, I absolutely think that tactic is not a bad one, because the Americans, their most radical period was the 1918, 1920s, when there was a general strike in Seattle, and you know there was like all this union organized. There was IWW members being deported to South America because their radical politics dubbed them a foreigner. Palmer raids.
You're talking about the angry young man, Harvey, and resistance to the state. And I was wondering how, because for me, looking at all of that in the 80s, what was going on in England, right? In the 80s, in terms of angry young man and resistance and anger, there was also the racial politics that I remember watching, right? In terms of immigration, for instance, and anti-immigrant rage from angry men, many of them, angry young men as well. So, and it makes me think about also, you know, the IWW is interesting, definitely, and has a long storied history, but it also has, and it also actually has an interesting race history, which, you know, we don't often talk about, right? But I think what does complicate all of that is the racial and migration histories that are also part of that, and how to talk about that, right, productively is also important. So something I'm thinking about is that around, let's say 2007, I think 2008 was the first one. So 2007, you know, every day, this is Chicago, we invented the 8-hour day and all of that. So every day May Day is a big deal. In as much as, you know, it's never a big deal in the rest of the US for the most part. But in Chicago, we still, you know, we have our parades and so on, marches rather. So every year until 2007, the May Day march was always a workers' march, quote unquote. It was a labor march. 2007, 2008 was when the big movement around undocumented people began. And I can still remember, I think it was 2000, let's say it's 2007. 2007, there was a big clash around the May Day march between the immigration rights, you know, or rather the undocumented rights organizers and the labor movement. There was a massive clash as to what that march would be. 2008, the undocumented movement had pretty much taken over, so that from then on, for quite a while, the May Day march became an immigration march. And you can see this in all the newspaper coverage. I was one of those who covered the changes, you know, we didn't record it. It went from being a labor march to being an immigration march. And one of the big issues in that, and one sliver sort of, you know, in that whole thing was also, however, that there were African-American organizers around May Day who pointed out you know, there was this whole discourse of immigrants are taking jobs away from African Americans. There was that whole controversy as well to deal with. So there was that complication, and that has been more or less smoothened out in some ways, mostly because of strategic alliances between all the different groups. But I don't know if necessarily that's a hopeful thing, because the undocumented movement in this country is a pile of shit. It so glad Zara's nodding. But it's a complete wag-ass pile of shit. It wants nothing but assimilate, not even it's horrible. It has taken the immigration organizing rightward to nothing but, you know, good people, good families, blah, blah, blah. It's like the gay marriage cause, you know, of immigration, etc. So there's that whole, you know, here, there's that kind of layer of complication around how do you make, right? Like, how do you start to make class analysis in an anarchistic framework even? How do you make that evident to people on the left? Because what I see here in the US is that constantly that argument keeps getting dragged over, right, into this kind of weird state assimilation model. One place that it has kind of worked in interesting ways, I would say, is the Chicago Teachers Union organizing in Chicago, which has resolutely refused so far to fall into the good subject model, and consistently has demanded, you know, things like worker rights, right? Organizing rights, more services for students, fewer, you know, no cops, et cetera, et cetera. But I think in the US, at least, it's very easy to take a lefty movement and then drag it towards the state with the notion of, yeah.
And it's noteworthy that West Virginia, a state really close to DC, had all these wildcat strikes from teachers just a year ago that completely paralyzed both parties of the state in the local state house. You know, and so I also agree that teacher organizing has been a zone of class-based organizing that has been extremely powerful, because teachers, I was going to be one for a while. I may still be one because academia won't give you a job, but teachers have been terribly, they used to have so much better pay, they used to have pensions, they used to have healthcare, all that is disappearing for them. So it's been a place where people have seen class, because teachers are supposed to be a middle class job in America. But of course, it was always done by women. It was never that middle class, you know. But it still has this, it's supposed to have a luster of stability, but no, not really in many places anymore, especially not in West Virginia, you know, even places like Connecticut a little bit. But, you know, so that's been a major point where people have been really getting activated. So I agree, a teacher struggle is really good. And I mean, I'm, you know, the IWW that I know castigate, you know, a lot of unions as too business union oriented, and I think that many of them are. But yeah. I do think that in Chicago you see a genuine leftist presence in a lot more organizations. I would walk around Chicago when I lived there, and I would run into communists just on a random street corner, on Grindr, wherever I happened to be. There were communists everywhere. You know, and that isn't the case anywhere else in the U.S. Nowhere else in the United States do you just run into a communist on your way to the grocery store. So Chicago has that unique touch.
Definitely not on Grindr. No commies on Grindr. Who are willing to come out as commies, right? Maybe a little bit. Right. There's the Chicago teachers, and then there are also it would be interesting, Zara, I wonder what you think of this, is it would be interesting in the US at least to see what the nurses will be doing, what the nurses unions will be doing, because nursing is becoming, and maybe it is where you are as well, but nursing is one of the front, you know, it's a big issue because of the frontline nature of that work, and nurses are organizing now. Unfortunately, what I've seen so far is that they have this tendency to deploy the same, you know, sort of affective, look at us, we're doing all this work for you, we take care of you, yeah, you know, which I think is bullshit, is a bullshit strategy which goes nowhere in the long run. But it's a potential for radical change. I just don't know, because also a lot of nurses, not a significant number of nurses are actually foreign born. They're often from the Philippines, Nigeria, and so on. So that's an issue as well in terms of who has power and who doesn't. But that's another potentiality. But that's sort of trying to get, both of us, I think, are trying to get at what you asked, Harvey, about, you know, I think essentially like, how do you make an anarchistic worker-based movement apparent on the left? In the US, it gets pulled over.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah, I think that's a really good answer. I think that what I'm most interested in at the moment is ways in which you can mobilize people to see things from a perspective of class, or of things that they're not used to seeing. Instead of seeing it as a binary of immigrants are this, certain form, how do you make people aware of certain other things, like consciousness raising, I suppose, and what techniques you can use?
Right.
One of the things that I do, I'm a teacher, and the school that I teach in is quite interesting because in Britain, it was quite famous in the 70s. There's quite a lot of documentaries about it. It was called, I don't know if anyone's heard about it. It was called the Countersculpture Experiment, and it basically was about this complete democratization of the school system. You know, the sort of basically we didn't have classrooms, we had these big open spaces, students went and learned what they wanted to learn. When I first started teaching there, they still called staff by their first name, all of that sort of thing has gone. But it's quite interesting because is this idea of in some areas, and the area that I teach in is quite an interesting one because it's a very working class area, but it's a very affluent area. So it's the working class area where people want to go and live once the working class has become a little bit richer. So it's very, very, it doesn't really sort of value education and so on, but it's that kind of them and us sort of feeling. And I've never sort of had it in any school I've ever been in before. I used to teach Harvey, which is why I'm part of this group. And that was a very different school in a very middle class area. And everybody was different because they, you know, sort of students like Harvey, their parents, friends were teachers. You know, there was this kind of sort of real sort of sense that teachers were human beings. Whereas I think when we go into these kind of communities, there is a real sort of antagonism towards teachers. And there's been a really interesting narrative going on. I don't know if anybody else has been really aware of it, because when teachers started to say that it wasn't safe to go back into schools yet, there's all this narrative of teachers should be heroes, teachers should be teachers should be sort of queuing up to go and do their duty, to, you know, sort of put themselves in danger just as the nurses have. But of course, in the nursing profession, it's interesting what you were saying about a kind of revolutionary feeling, because what our government have done now is basically deprived nurses of all kinds of rights they did promise. So, for example, student nurses were taken out of their final year of university and told they had to go on the front line and nurse, and now they've had their contracts taken from them as the pandemic started to ease, and they no longer have a qualification, and they don't have any kind of qualification, and they don't have any pay, and there's no. And it's interesting, this narrative around sort of professionals and what, you know, this government seems to sort of have this idea that sort of professionals in these kind of caring professions are almost kind of heroes, but at the same time we're discarded, or the narrative turns against us.
Yes.
Drop of a hat.
No, and I think what is interesting about the CTU, the Chicago Teachers Union, is that they were also facing exactly that narrative that you point to, Anna, which is, you know, the narrative of hero. And for instance, a lot of teachers across the US have to spend their own money in buying school supplies, which is ridiculous. I mean, what, you know, why? But that was always seen as a heroic thing to do. Oh, look how wonderful they are, you know. And you had these advertisements on TV, you know, saying, oh, look at this teacher. She's going in and spending $150 every week on school supplies, which is fucked up. Like, why isn't the school supplying all of that, right? So I think what is interesting to note about CTU is that they were able to somehow, and that's, so giveaway is that a lot of people have written about the CTU, but it's also a chapter in my book, which is to talk about how the CTU managed to resist that heroizing sort of narrative. And also at the same time, yes, they also faced antagonism. You know, a lot of times people in the media in particular were saying things like, you know, CTU teachers, and it's true, as Zara pointed out, it was, for a long time, it was a solid avenue into the middle class. You could make about, you know, 100,000 plus as a CTU teacher, as a Chicago teacher, depending on your years and seniority and so on. And there were people who were actually angry about that, right? And so this is America, where a country where people are actually complaining that teachers get to go to Europe perhaps, or have nice food, or enjoy fine wine. How dare they, right? Why aren't they struggling in poverty? So what is interesting about CTU is that it has so far been able to resist both the kind of anger and antagonism and the kind of heroizing. And what is interesting to me is to figure out exactly how they did that. But certainly, Anna, the narratives, what you point to, yes, we've seen here, and I think that's still prevalent for most of the United States, unfortunately.
Because one of the things I think we've definitely got over here is a kind of cultural idea of class. Abby mentioned the sun earlier, and the sun very much uses a celebration of the working class in terms of a particular cultural idea of what the working class are. And it's generally a right-wing version of what the working classes are. There is this kind of idea that Corbyn voters are the sort of metropolitan elite and somehow too middle class. And actually the real working kind of class don't necessarily.
The salty working classes. Yes, that's always the ideal of the working class, even in the US, the salty ones, you know, the authentic ones.
Be proud of being working class as long as you look at tits and you don't think too hard about stuff.
The Sun used to have like a page 3, which was always...
Oh yeah, it's no longer there? Did they take out page 3?
They've still got it, but the women actually wear a top.
Yeah, and they say something interesting about politics every time.
Oh,
so it's like Mandy believes that the divide between state and church is too radical for the time, blah, blah, blah.
It's like the beauty pageant, isn't it? The idea of, you know, sort of Miss World, the idea that we somehow need to reinvent it with the modern world, so we try and give a little bit more of an intellectual sort of feeling to the woman in the swimsuit.
I want world peace and an end to hunger. Oh goodness, I see a dog on a couch. There is nothing more delightful than a sleeping dog, unless it's a very large cat.
You've got cats, right? You go for cats.
They're technically dead, but yes, I have cats.
Oh.
It's sort of technically dead. Yes, Toby and Frida. Yes, Toby and then Frida. Yes, animals and their existence in our lives and how they determine the left as well. How the left conceives of power, right? That's always sort of fascinating. How does the left conceive of power in a particular realm, you know, in academia or in food or about animals? It's very interesting to me, just to talk, I mean, if you don't mind me talking very briefly about animals, it's very interesting to me that what passes for a left discourse on animals is unfortunately, I think, so reductionist and sort of, you know, eco-ish and not at all embedded in analyses of power. That's very unfortunate to me. I mean, so for here, in the US, I think it's actually a UK-based organization, right? PETA or PETA, however they pronounce it. People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. I think it originated in the UK, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So it's very unfortunate to me that that never took on what could actually have been a tremendously powerful anti-capitalist stance. You know, it just kind of devolved into, I don't know, you know, when Katrina hit, PETA went around saying that it would give vegan food baskets to anyone who needed food during, you know, an absolute horrible natural disaster, right? But on the condition that people would agree to becoming vegans. And I was just like, motherfuckers, seriously? You are literally blackmailing people hit by one of the worst natural disasters that this country has seen. And you're basically blackmailing them, you know? So its politics around humans is really have been awful consistently now. But it's so unfortunate because that, you know, if you think about factory farming and you think of any number of issues around animals, right? That right there is fecund ground for a strong anti-capitalist politics that could link up with issues around race. You know, when you think about the history of agriculture in this country and how it's been tied to property and slave owning and all of that. There's so much we could have done, but no, blackmail people into becoming vegan.
Isn't this like one of the problems also with potentially with ecological stuff, that you can sometimes downplay the worth of human beings and actually focus on, oh, isn't nature wonderful or something like this, and actually
very pagan.
Yes, yeah, exactly, yeah, which kind of dissociates itself. And again, if you actually wanted to look at paganism, you could have a really much more interesting analysis, but that's not what we're getting.
Yeah.
Right? Gender, race, everything could be tied in, but no, the namaste point of leftism. Current Affairs has a podcast. I'm plugging Current Affairs now. They have a podcast where they all talked about whether or not one of them, my friend Eli, should go to law school. It ended up being a really fascinating discussion about the law and about the role of lawyers.
Yes.
Right? In movement, or what good is a lawyer, right? Do we first kill them all, or do we, or do we actually think about the law and lawyers as useful tools as well in creating revolutionary? It's a fascinating discussion, which I highly recommend.
It's quite interesting though, because we have a very unusual sort of legal system. I don't know if there's a parallel in America. Mm-hmm. I was a barrister before I was a teacher years before, and as a working class woman, I was very much sort of never really felt comfortable. I mean, I think if I'd done it later, I think I would have been much more comfortable to say, fuck you, this is who I am. But in my 20s, I found it a really difficult environment. And I think there's a difference between being a solicitor and being a barrister, very much so. And I think I would have been, if I'd gone down the solicitor route, I think I'd been bored. I'd been bored, but at the same time, there wouldn't have been this kind of sort of tension. Whereas at the bar, I was deeply, deeply uncomfortable. And I think ultimately we have a very interesting kind of, it kind of supports the class system.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting one with the bar. I mean, I was a barrister in the 90s. And one of the things that was interesting was that I had a friend who was a working class black woman. And she had a much easier time at the bar than I did. And that was because the Black Barristers Association were much more organised and militant. And, there was, and I still don't think there's a white working class presence at the bar. And I don't think it's very difficult to access it if you're not Oxbridge.
Yes, right.
And it's an interesting one when you think about the role of the law in sort of what's held in the class system. We have a deeply class-ridden legal system, not in solicitors, but in the bar, certainly.
Definitely, yes. And that was actually one of the things that did come up, Anna, in that conversation, was also about class and also the role played by the institutions that you attend, right? So which Yale, would you go to Yale Law School? Do you go to U of Penn, or do you go to, the John Jay College here in Chicago, for instance? Yeah, that again is an indication of how class does play a function in the US, but no one wants to acknowledge it. What I admire about, you guys is that it's out there. It's just like, yes. We just keep pretending it doesn't exist. But that is actually fascinating in terms of, especially what you were saying about whether or not you could have dealt with it differently if you'd gone into it at a later age. That's interesting to me. And also the question of race, yeah.
They made me change my name.
They made you change your name?
Yeah, they made me change my name because my name, it's an interesting thing, because I've been interested in this thing in America called the Karen movement, where they call everybody a Karen.
Oh, yes, yeah, Karens, yes.
Yeah, well, I'm a Tracy. So I don't know whether you would have that in America, but I think everybody in Britain will know. I think Bradley and Abby and Harvey all know what connotations the name Tracy has. And they refused to employ me with my first name. So therefore, so Anna's my middle name, but they decided that I couldn't be about. They wouldn't take me on as a pupil with the name Tracy. It's bizarre, isn't it?
That's hideous. Is it because Tracy was seen as too working class? Is that it?
Yeah, absolutely. Too working class.
Wow. That is enormous amounts of fucked upness.
Yeah. My friend who's got a very Scouse accent was told that she couldn't be a barrister with a Scouse accent with Liverpool.
Yeah, accent is a huge deal. Yeah, accent is also a huge deal in the US. Interestingly, again, not everyone will admit to it, but it is. It's a huge deal here. And sometimes people will use a working class, not a Southern accent in interesting ways, especially with Bill Clinton. I think that Southern accent thing became a way to mobilize power in interesting ways. But a Southern accent here is still considered Hicksville and all of that. But which is fascinating because, much of the power in this country has come from Texas. The most brutal forces have spoken with a strong Texan twang, which they emphasize as they fuck you over. So, it's like, wow, but they changed you, they made you change your name, Anna. I'm sorry.
Another view about lawyers in the US, I was heavily involved in the intercollegiate debate community in the US, specifically a form of debate called policy debate. And a lot of people from that form of debate become lawyers. And when I was debating in college, there was a bunch of really militant Black debaters that were succeeding and beating all the white kids from the fancy schools like Georgetown, Northwestern, and you would get these law firms coming into these debate tournaments attempting to shut down these Black kids that were because they're like, this is where we're getting our debaters, this is where we're getting our future lawyers, and you're getting in the way of that, And so I definitely saw some lawyers acting in fairly reactionary ways in that kind of context, where you were seeking former lawyers. People who were trained in debate were lawyers from the 80s or 70s were mostly white guys, right? So they expected future lawyers to be like them, to think like them, to look like them, behave like them. And these young Black debaters from places like Baltimore who were winning all these debate tournaments across the nation, they were not what these lawyers were thinking as successors. So there was a huge effort for them to be like, hey, we're going to start this new tournament, and if you talk about certain things, you can't come, and all these kind of silly things like that. And they were the ones who were funding things, so of course they were able to have a huge influence. So I do think that there's a way in which people can go through training to be a lawyer, and you have to really be a conformist to get a job, and everyone else doesn't really get a job, is what I hear from people in that world. So I think that there's definitely some reactionary elements that contain the possibility of lawyers becoming all that radical in the United States mostly. I mean, there's always exceptions.
It also kind of highlights the fluidity of what it means to what law is, right? Because you're pretending that there's this objective law which your country follows, but then there's something at stake at who takes on the mantle of that. If it's a generation of Black lawyers that are debating in a certain way, they're going to be thinking about the law and justice in terms of a form that you weren't particularly accepting of when you were going through. So there's power at stake in that.
I think the trick is intergenerationality and forming bonds across surprising 20-year structures. I felt it the entire way through my 40s. I felt like I was a conduit between the 20s and the 60s. And now I've kind of arrived in a different decade altogether. I know the intersectionality, the core of it is about being able to communicate between generations.
That is so interesting that you would bring that up, because the concept of intergenerationality has been pretty much stomped out of existence in the queer community. It's been more, a little bit. It's a little bit here and there, but the queer community, as most of you probably know, is, as we know, right, is that for a long time, gay men and women would make their way out of small towns into urban areas, and find community among older gays and lesbians. And at one point, for instance, gay men would adopt their lovers because that was the only way to pass on their estates or, whatever money they had, for instance. But there were these complicated relationships between younger queers and older queers, which were sometimes sexual, but not always, but often were, but were also about providing literal shelter and resources to younger queers who came in. And you had actually communities of queer people where these kinds of relationships existed in different ways, and laterally and horizontally and so on. And now, today, you're never going to see any sort of established, mainstream gay person even acknowledge that they have even a much younger friend, perhaps, right? So the idea of intergenerationality is now linked to quote unquote pedophilia, because there's that. So there are ways in which mainstream gays, for instance, have social relationships that pretty much mimic straight family structures. And what's interesting, of course, is that, especially at least in urban areas and other places, straight family relationships are very different because of matters like divorce and so on. Familial structures are changing drastically and for the better for the most part, because of divorce and extended families and so on. But gay people are reverting to a much older model of heterosexual forms of relationships, and that's where intergenerationality is not allowed. What is interesting is that recently a state rep, and I'm blanking out on all the details, but he is white, and he was engaged in a debate with a black state rep who started talking about the fact that as a black man with a black son, he always had to worry about his child and, the violence and so on. And this white state rep turned around and said, well, are you saying that none of us in this room might have children of color? And the black guy turned to him and said, dude, I'm not talking about you. Shut up, right? I'm talking about systematic, social issues. Anyway, long story short, the white guy turns around the next day, tweets out a photograph of a young 20-year-old and says, this is my Cuban son whom I adopted legally, of course, when he was 12. So this has become now this topic of discussion here, because what is this white dude doing with a young 20-year-old in his house whom he supposedly adopted as a 12-year-old from Cuba, right? So all of this discussion now is about what is exactly this relationship between this white guy and this Cuban guy, right? What is going on here? And it may well be that it's that it's a coercive relationship. It may be that it's not. What is interesting to me is that the framing of this conversation around, older guy and younger guy, right, both is now tinged with, right, all of this sort of miasma around, pedophilia, did he traffic him? We don't know anything right now. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that in terms of intergenerationality, we've gone from a time of that was how the queer community actually formed itself to a time where no gay person wants to be seen as, a possible pedophile. The only time Milo Yiannopoulos, I think I'm mispronouncing his name, the conservative commentator, he's actually from your side.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Milo, we all call him Milo because none of his, I apologize that I don't recall his actual name. But the only time he actually made sense was when he gave a surprisingly interesting and very articulate description of the history of intergenerational sex among gay men. Right. And when he said, I learned about sex when I gave a blowjob to my Catholic priest. And he said, it didn't harm me. This is what I learned from it, etc. That was the one time he actually made sense. And of course, he got canceled. And then he went back to being the usual jerk, being an asshole as always. But for that brief glimmering moment, Milo made sense. And I was very surprised. But that's how radioactive intergenerationality, the concept of, has become in the queer community. And I think it's our loss, really. I think people should feel free to disagree, of course.
I suppose one of the things I was going to ask you was about this concept of utopia. And you mentioned it in your manifesto, but I think it sort of runs through using critique in order to help us envision a different future. I think one of the things that I might have it actually, where you were talking about too many on the left have declared utopias useless because they are, too utopian. Yet a manifesto creating a utopian is exactly what we crave, what we need. It helps us formulate our ideology.
Sometimes people are surprised, given my level of critique of so many institutions, they're surprised that I want a utopia, that I actually believe in that, right? And what I want is a utopia that in some ways is a utopia we construct first without thinking about people. So at the same time that we think about what it is that people need, the question that I asked throughout the manifesto is, what is it that people need and how do we get it to them without asking them to debase themselves? Because I feel like that's the situation we're in all over the world now, right? Even in perhaps not some countries, but in most places, right, we're constantly saying to people, we will get you what you need, but you first have to beg for it in one way or the other, by declaring yourself a good subject, or by simply literally begging for food, etc., etc. So for me, I think in terms of, how do we think about utopia? I think the first thing we have to do is stop thinking about people in the sense that we start thinking not about how do we get things to people we like, but how do we get things to people in a distribution system of sorts where people just have what they need. And this is where I think it's not only about resources, it's not only about housing and food and, clean air and all of that. Certainly all of that, yes. But it's also about how do we treat people even when they go awry, right? What do we do with people who fuck things up? And so, for instance, one of the, I've always been interested in, and I write a lot about, and I will be writing much more about sex offender registries. And I don't know what you call them.
Yeah, we have the same thing, yeah.
Call the same thing, right? So, sex offender registries are horrible, heinous methods of social control. They're terrible. They're really horrible, especially in the US. Basically, if you end up on a sex offender registry, that's it. Your life is over. I mean, I've interviewed people for pieces, and it's devastating to listen to them. Their lives are just over, right? No employment. No one will employ you. You're probably going to be homeless or semi-homeless as you wander from place to place, because you have all these restrictions about 300 feet away from, a school, 100 feet away from a playground, yada, yada, yada. Anyway, so that's how we deal with things in the US, right? We completely stigmatize them. First of all, what is, even a violent sex misdemeanor is actually, the way those things are defined are terrible, blah, blah, blah. But it's a horrible existence, right? That's how we deal with things in the US. We completely stigmatize them and throw them out. So even if they had committed harm, there is no way to reel them back in and to even give them any kind of restoration, right, of their lives. There's no way to even talk to the people they have affected to bring restoration to their lives. It's just banish and paralyze. In places like Sweden, it's rather different. In Sweden, at least the last time I checked in on this, a sex offender, I think there's some kind of a registry system, but basically everyone in the community knows that you just don't let, the kids are told, everyone's told, they still live in their communities. The kids know not to go to Mr. Anderson's house. There are just ways, institutional sort of systemic ways of ensuring all of that, and things move along, right? So that person gets to live a life, perhaps reflect if damage was caused, reflect upon the harm caused, think about how to move forward. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that what we have to think of, that's what I mean when I say get people out of the equation and start thinking about what is it that we want done when harm is caused. What is it that we want to happen when we see poverty, right? How do we want to see an end to suffering? How do we see an end to suffering, not only of those who have suffering brought upon them, but those who commit the suffering, all of that. And so I think a utopia has to do with, what has been done to people, what do people need, and how do we get it to them, rather than, can we ensure that we like everyone in this goddamn world? Right? Because we don't. People are assholes. I mean, most people are assholes. Most people I meet, I hate. Honestly. I'm suspicious about nearly everyone I meet. You all know. But for the most part. I look at people and I don't trust you. It takes you 10 days for you to figure out, for you to convince me that I should like you. That's fine. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay to be that way. But if shit happens to you, I don't want you to suffer. I may hate you, but I don't want you to suffer, right? So that, I guess, is like, for me, that makes more sense as an ideology and as a way of thinking about what you want the world to look like, than screening people, based on personality or how they conduct themselves in the world, all of that.
I suppose there's a kind of almost like a violence in love, because you're saying that certain people aren't potentially worthy, right? Or is that something?
I'm saying, yeah, I think a lot of people are shits.
Yeah.
I think many people are shits for different reasons, right? And I'm not really concerned. That's one of the things I think I took away from organizing, which is, you know, you organize with people, for instance, to bring about an action, right? So I remember organizing with people in this boycott against a hotel in Chicago, which was infamous. It was infamous for having the longest strike against it. But I remember organizing with people, you know, with whom our group tussled a lot. But what we agreed on was, you know, this hotel is shit. It's treating its workers like shit. We need to protest and let the patrons know to boycott it, etc. So we met up on that ground. And that was what mattered, right? And yeah, I mean, I think perhaps the other thing that's affecting me, and this is slightly personal, is that I am frequently in situations where I walk into a room of complete strangers, and I find that 6 of them will have already hated me. I'm just like, do I know you? You're being a complete asshole to me. I don't know why. And then it turns out, you know, they read my piece on polyamory, which I critique. And they read my piece on gay marriage, which I shit on constantly. Right? But they formed this idea that, oh, this bitch, you know. So, and then they will say things to me. And I'm just like, do I I don't know what's going on. So it's born out of that as well. My understanding that people are shits to me when they don't even know me, right? They don't make any effort to know me. And it, you know, so I understand, I guess what I'm trying to say, I understand what it feels like to be on multiple margins. So my attitude is, you know, rather than replicate that marginalizing, because I could easily turn around and say, since people are so mean to me, I'm just going to be mean to everyone else in my vision of the world. And rather my attitude is, you know, I think this is fucked up and shit and just needs to be wiped out. So let's figure out a way to not do this again, right? When shit happens to us, I think our first instinct should be, okay, anger, hurt, all of that, yes. But then I think the instinct after that should be, let us make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. You know, I think that is how we should go around the world. Like, don't let the shit that happens to you happen to other people. Like, that's the lesson we should take. Not, let's replicate this shit. You know?
Is there something like justice versus love? Like justice is maybe more impersonal or something? Is that maybe the...
Yes, exactly. Yeah. What is justice, right? Yeah, and that's the question I keep asking around social justice, right? What is justice? What is this ephemeral, this weird abstraction that I think we should work towards? And how do we work towards it? And the understanding that working towards that notion of justice is about spilling a lot of blood in the streets at some point, right? It's about pain. I don't think we're going to achieve racial justice on this planet if we don't understand that a lot of us are going to be horrible to each other and that we are going to be killing each other and that there will be blood spilled. I think that's just something we just have to understand, because our histories, our collective history and our individual histories are all built on blood. It's all genocide and slavery all the way down. You know, there is no country in this world, no country, not on any continent, that can claim otherwise. And to reverse that and to move forward means the spilling of more blood.
Harvey, you were just mentioning something about Benjamin's violence or something on the chat.
Yeah. Well, I was just posting it. My parents are asleep above me. I'm staying at their house at the moment, so I'm trying to be quiet.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, but I just think that it's a very interesting essay to read about justice, because it places it as something beyond, but something that you strive towards. And that so he makes a difference between divine justice and mythic justice. Mythic justice being justice that we implement in our societies, and divine justice, the thing which critiques the justice that we have, but you can never point to it as something. And I think that, yeah, if you're interested in that kind of stuff, I'm sure if you have read it, then
no, I haven't, and I'm just copying it and pasting it into a document.
It's a really, really wonderful essay, actually. Very, very difficult, so you've got to be quite generous with it at the beginning. It was like most of the stuff he's done, it wasn't a completed or published essay. So it's just his thoughts on it, and he ends with this very, very dangerous kind of claim that only divine justice can destroy mythic justice, which is quite theological. And so Derrida responds to it in an essay called Force of Law. And I think that there's a very interesting way that you can look at both the essay and both Derrida's response, because I think that both of them are trying to get at the thing that Benjamin's trying to respond to in the first place, is this intangibility of justice, this justice to come of ideas. I'm guessing if you're familiar with US politics, you've heard of the Cornel West.
Yes.
Yeah. What do you think about his kind of idea of the tradition of Christian love? Because in terms of my morality, I think that I take a lot from Cornel West's idea of committing to love, and it's almost in the same way that you're critiquing the idea of love, right? So the point that I made about semantics is kind of coming up again, because he's saying, like, there's a question, it's like, oh, do you love your enemy? And he's like, oh, I'm working on that, brother. And I think it's this same kind of thing. It's applying different terminology, right? But there's still something fundamentally similar in the way that you're both processing this difficulty. Is people that you struggle to love, there needs to be something which sustains your caring for them. And how can you characterize that if not through some sort of theological or spiritual idea of what love might be?
Yeah. So West for me has I haven't read enough of him. He's always been a bit of a perplexing and sometimes infuriating figure because of his, as you know, his, the whole Obama thing was strange. So there was this moment where he has this need to be a quote unquote public intellectual. And I think in the process, sometimes I always look at him and think, at what point are you deferring or giving up or abdicating certain principles in service of, perhaps, right, this model that you want to become of the public intellectual? But at the same time, no, I think his work and his written work is very different from his projection of himself. So there's that I want to acknowledge those complications. So not being quite familiar, is my way of putting it, is with his notion of love. I more recently, I think it seems more theological, as you pointed out, than something that I sort of came across rather late in life, which was Baldwin's idea of love, which is a different notion of love, which is an abstraction. And I think it's a notion of love which has been taken up, certainly in certain radical queer circles especially, right? A notion of love which is about communality and about, connection. But I think Baldwin has this, and I really wish, I really need to print it out and put it somewhere so that I can keep referring to it whenever I talk to people about love. But it's an abstraction. It's an idea of connection that is not dependent upon individuals relating to each other, but it's about a set of principles that we fight for. That's my very relatively banal way of putting it, right? So, and I have been struck by that passage for a very long time. It comes, I forget which one of his well-known essays, but that resonates with me. Theological love, someone I care about a great deal, I think thinks and writes about that a great deal and processes it in his life, I think also. So I've been more interested in that as a result, even though for various reasons in my life, I've always been sort of fundamentally, even though I was raised by wolves, which is to say I was raised by Jesuits, even though I was raised by, but perhaps because I was raised by Jesuits, I tend to be non-theological. I tend to sort of push away from the theological, because that's what Jesuits do, right? Jesuits are like the atheists of the religious world. And, they're like, yeah, we're here for God, kind of, sort of, but we're going to militate against empire, we're going to, all of that. So I'm trying to get a hold on how to, I think my friends' thinking helps me do that much more. Like, how do you think about even theological love in a non-theological sort of way is interesting. And I thought Baldwin was getting at that. But thank you for reminding me that I really should pay more. Every time I want to pay more attention to Cornel West, he pops up and he says something that just makes me go, okay, I'd rather read someone else right now.
Yeah.
But, in the next year, yes, he's one of the people I need to be much better acquainted with, because he's also very important to American progressivism and left politics.
Yeah.
He's a very foundational and influential figure for many people.
Benjamin is kind of like, if I was to idolize anybody, I'd say that I idolized his kind of thinking, because this essay in particular, talking about the divine, there's a very theological aspect to his thought, right? And so in his final work, the thesis of the philosophy of history, he starts by saying that historical materialism is a puppet, that a little dwarf that's really ugly and no one wants to talk about, called theology, hides behind and pulls the strings of the machine. And I think that what I'm really interested in is how these terms migrate. So when we talk about justice now, okay, it's a very interesting question and a very difficult question to answer. And by pretending that it doesn't have some resemblance to the theological idea of agape love, obscures the answer rather than leads you to new formulations of it. So that's not to say that you should embrace and accept these ideas, but the correlation is there and important to see, because the idea of what we're trying to do, the human transcendental projects, are fundamentally this transcendental form that used to take the form of theology.
Right.
So you like by looking at that, that's how you can be truly like an atheist, in the way that Nietzsche thought that he was an atheist, right? Of you understand the systems that move things, and yet you want to dissolve them because you understand them. Like, naming them is the way of destroying them.
It's very Jesuit too. Yes. I'm sorry, I don't keeping to bring them up, but yeah, it just reminds me of all my padres. Yes, yeah.
Is that positive for you?
Yes, I love them, and I think I've been deeply influenced by them.
Yeah.
I feel like I've spent most of my life essentially trying to be a Jesuit priest. Right. Yes, I mean, if that was your question, yes. Yeah, that's a whole other, yes. There's a video, and I'm not mocking any mean at all, but there's a wonderful video of a cat that wants to date. Anyway, Perfect Strangers. It's called Perfect Strangers. Let me see if I can find that. Where he
You can share the screen if you want to share it.
Sorry, love?
You can share the screen if you want to share it.
Oh, that's true. I can.
Dear perfect stranger, I am Mano, a feral cat, born in a Brooklyn alley, 2 years old, neutered, male, full of love with no place to put it. But I will give my love to perfect strangers. Will you love me back? A couple of days ago I found a toy rat, set him up on a table and enclosed him in a heart-shaped frame. I superimposed him over a series of videos I found of strangers singing a song from the musical Rent.
Seasons of
I posted the video to an online dating service. Nobody responded to my online video of the rat. It made me feel so compressed. I knew that I needed to put my own face on the internet if I ever wanted to truly connect with a stranger, one-on-one. So this is why I'm putting this Valentine online. Are we connecting? Walter Benjamin wrote, the only way of knowing a person is to love them without hope. I don't know what he means, but the sentiment fills me with a lovely combination of romantic abandon and dread. Hippopotamus, the great thinker from repose, said, if everyone knew how to herd sheep, there would be no one left to write poetry. I invite perfect strangers like you to join me in this perfect song. Use a computer to superimpose your head over that of Bronson Pinchot. And together we will stand tall on the wings of a shared dream.
Sometimes the world looks perfect, nothing to rearrange. Sometimes you just get a feeling like you need some kind of change. No matter what the odds are this time, nothing's gonna stand in my way. This flame in my heart, like a long lost friend, gives every dark street a light at the end. Standing tall on the wings of my dream, rise and fall on the wings of my dream. The rain and thunder, the wind and haze, I'm bound for better days. My life, my dream, nothing's gonna stop me now.
Don't be ridiculous.
That was amazing. Oh my God.
So how we got
Practicing.
mocking, the great WB, but it was like, I love that video. I don't even know if it's an actual quotation or not,
No, it is. Yeah, it is.
Okay.
Yeah, in his arcades project, but it's beautiful.
It's and Perfect Strangers, the idea of love. Yes, I post that video every chance I get. That's me, I guess. That cat, yes. But abstraction, love. What do we do with love and abstraction?
Polyamory, I guess. I don't know.
Oh, you were critical of polyamory, weren't you, Yasmin?
No, I'm very critical of polyamory. I'm not critical of polyamory, the practice, as much as the idiotic, sort of narrative in which it's wrapped up. I wrote two pieces actually. One is called Your Sex is Not Radical, which was my first critique of polyamory, where I said, if you don't have a way of demolishing capitalism, there's no point in just fucking everyone around it, right? I mean, like fucking, because a lot of people, especially in our queer radical circles, right, sort of equate fucking with radical politics. And that's just not necessarily true. I mean, some of my most radical left friends are serial monogamists. I mean, they marry every year. They don't just date, they marry. But they have amazing critical, critiques of capitalism. So, and then the second piece I wrote is titled Polyamory is Gay Marriage for Straight People. Because basically what I argue is that polyamory kind of makes, sexual relations of a certain kind very exciting, and it allows people to kind of project an attitude of daring, but it's still, you can be polyamorous and also be strongly anti-capitalist. It's not that, they're contradictory, but that the discourse on polyamory, the discourse on sex, on fucking, in essence, has become a way for people to signal their supposed, sort of left credentials. And my point is simply, that signaling is useless if you're not actually working and thinking through how to actually demolish capitalism, right? How do you demolish systems of oppression and all of that? And you can still fuck your way through it, that's fine. It also came about because of, it came about because friends of mine had, who were trying to get into radical organizing, were made to feel shamed because they didn't have sexual lives that translated, as quote unquote radical enough, which made no sense. And I was very angry on behalf of one of my friends, which is how I started writing and thinking about this. So.
The one thing that I find, so I got into an argument on the beach last summer with this guy, and my issue with polyamorous discourse is not to do with not necessarily your critique, but there's something about the way that people bring it up which is more conservative. They justify it as something natural, that it's a more natural way of human beings living their lives, as if that's sort of just like, oh, if we were living in tribes in the past, we would be in more polyamorous relationships. Well, we'd also have more intimate relationships. So you could also argue that the more natural thing is having an intimate relationship rather than many unintimate ones.
Right.
And yeah, it's the way that people, I don't know, I think that maybe my friends that argue for polyamory are trying to do something different with it. They're trying to make something more conservative and more ingrained about the action of polyamory, rather than say that it's a radical practice.
Right. Yeah.
It's interesting. Your critique is strange to me, because that wouldn't be the place that I would start with sexuality as a political practice. Why do you think? Is it because a lot of your friends have said that their sexual practices is related to their politics, or?
Yes. A lot of friends and non-friends. There's a pretty strong polyamorous cohort in Chicago among queer radicals, especially interestingly among queer radicals in their early 20s. It's very interesting how it's sort of sprung up here as a way to solidify inclusion. Speaking of inclusion, right? About inclusion in a radical set, you first have to go on declaring yourself polyamorous. That's very much, that's a Chicago thing. And it may not be a Chicago thing in the next 10 years, but right now that's where things are. So yes, absolutely. It's very interesting because those same people are also invested in things like gay marriage and have no critique of how gay marriage is implicated, right, in the state, and in how the state uses marriage, not just gay marriage, but marriage, right, as a way to further capitalist, capitalism itself. So it's been bizarre to watch this kind of depoliticizing of sex, in a sense, or rather the lack of awareness of how sex and intimate relationships are actually also bound up with the state is interesting to me, as, I guess, Abby, to bring up your point originally, as a Marxist. I guess I'm always shocked at that. How do you not understand that this is about power relations, Yeah.
And our gay communities in Brighton are the straightest in the city.
Right.
Some of them are super, super right wing, home owning,
right.
all of the things, landlords, everything.
Yeah.
I would suppose that from my sort of the stance that I would take, and this is not to critique your I think that it would be the opposite kind of approach, is that instead of my friends justifying polyamory on the basis of some sort of naturalism of heralding to the past, I think that you should, the way that I should try and understand it is how it emerges out of the material conditions of the world that you live in, right? And why has polyamory become such a large phenomenon? Because I think that in the past it was something which was a subversive phenomenon, and in Brighton at least, and a bit in London, polyamory became more of a norm, a response to normal conditions. And I think that it was to do with lack of intimacy within. So that would be my kind of defense of it, is how is it a response to the alienating effects of capitalism? And that would be the way of justifying it.
Yeah. Harvey, yes, absolutely. I think that is absolutely true, that polyamory definitely grew out of that impulse, right? Absolutely. In the US, what happened is interesting in terms of polyamory is that it's a class thing. So basically, when you first heard about polyamory, especially in the mid to late 20th century, was in what we call Ren fairs. They are the Renaissance fairs. Do you have maybe not, you don't have to, because you're the country of origin from which this springs. Basically, Ren fair.
We've seen The Simpsons. We know what you're talking about.
Yeah, so the whole dressing up, right, as medieval people, okay. And Ren fairs were not edgy. they were considered very dorky. They were considered, they were also very class-based. I mean, although it does take a substantial amount of money, to make those costumes and to become, a silversmith and all of that, but they were very classed in a particular way, and they were mostly seen as white people thing. And also the word that we use here, the phrase we use here is white trash, right? So a slightly upper white trashy kind of aura about all of it. Ren fairs are where polyamory really kind of became a thing. And that was ignored until polyamory somehow made it into urban centers and became a way for urban urban and urbane people to declare their level of sophistication. Look at us, we are so hip, we have no need for normative, ways of relating to each other. So it became a class thing. And what's interesting is that its origins in Ren Fair have been erased. So it's very much a class thing here. It's become a way to signify not only your sexual, your sexual polyness, as it were, but also your class status. It's a weird American phenomenon in that sense. But you're absolutely right that, polyamory was in many ways a way to kind of resist. And when you think about its class origins in the US, then that becomes even more interesting, right? Like, how does this circulate within a certain class structure in a country that consistently denies that it has any kind of class structure? How does polyamory circulate within a certain class structure and then go somewhere else and become something else altogether?
Yeah. But then instead of a critique of how it's not radical enough, because if you perceive it in terms of things emerge, but then they become catastrophic in this, but to put it in normal terms, not Benjaminian terms, like how things become normalized and homogenized into a certain form. Maybe the more interesting thing of talking about polyamory is not how it's failed to be radical, but asking what kind of radical problem was it emerging to deal with that then became subservient to something else.
I think that's a really interesting point. What could it have become, in other words, right, as well? What was its radical potential is, I think, what you're asking, I think.
Yeah. What was the object that it was trying to undermine?
Right. That's a good question.
I'm determined that it's like there to undermine the misogyny of feminism and like the lack of agreeing with the male impulse.
I think one of the reasons I have been critical about polyamory here again, I think that's a really important question to ask, but also is that it actually ended up becoming part of a misogynistic structure. So polyamory became a way, and there have actually been reports among polyamorous communities of men, for instance, using polyamory to enforce various kinds of sexual and other kinds of hierarchies. So that's always been an issue. And here in the US as well, we do have a problem with cults of all sorts and of all colors. Right. So you
really do. It's definitely an issue.
What the fuck it is, but we do. I think it's because we have such a massive country that there's just a place, lots of space, for people to just go and have a cult in what in other countries would be an entire half a country. We have like one county is that big, right? So it's very easy in the United States to just go anywhere randomly. There's a really good documentary series on a man named Bhagwan Rajneesh from India. I forget what the documentary is named. Does anyone know about Bhagwan Rajneesh? He was this weird Indian cult guy. Rajneesh documentary, hang on. Which goes into some of this stuff. Wild, Wild Country.
Right, he came out here to Oregon, set up a community, decided he was going to take over local politics, But his folks, his people, decided to use an unorthodox method of spraying salmonella, I believe, on banquets and buffets and public restaurants, so that they could poison everyone who might have voted for a different candidate in local elections.
You're in Oregon then, yeah. Yeah. It's a fascinating documentary. Fascinating. Yeah.
This is like Chuck Palahniuk, but made real. I can't believe this.
Chuck Palahniuk?
Like, he wrote Fight Club, right?
He's also an Oregon author. Worth.
Yes, yeah. It was bizarre, but it's very interesting. Yeah. And in terms of like, that's, and also, of course, you know, right? What's his name? Who's the Kool-Aid guy?
Jim Jones.
So the ways in which polyamory always ends up becoming a way to control women rather than allowing women to assert their sexual independence, I guess is my point. But all of that being said, yes, exactly, to what you said, Harvey. That's to ponder, yeah. And did that perhaps, was that perhaps a possibility in the Ren Fairs? I don't know, you know. Ren Fairs also had their own very interesting sexual systems, shall we say.
I think that the talk a couple of weeks ago that we had about Mark Fisher, like, it really, really touched me in a way that something hasn't done for a very, very long time, because what Mark Fisher was trying to get at is exactly kind of what I was saying earlier about if you could imagine a centre which is conservatism, and then outside of it you have this big bubble of different movements all struggling for different freedom in different terms. And there are people now that practice polyamory and they think that it's a revolutionary practice for them, right? So you can take two options as somebody from the left critiquing this kind of thing. You can either say, you're not very revolutionary in your actions. You've failed to meet these certain criteria because you think it's doing this, but it's not. And I don't think that that's necessarily, I don't even think that that's incorrect. There's failures in movements. But I think that something more important for left-wing politics to progress in a way which doesn't just become segmented and siloed will be to say, what are you trying to achieve with this? What do you think you're trying to achieve? How can we use this achievement against what you're trying to reject,
right,
as a tool within the structures in which we can then move forward and think about how we can do a left-wing politics? And like that for me in the last 2 weeks has become fundamentally like my mindset of
right.
How do you encompass these kind of things into conversation instead of just critiquing them? How can you say, yes, I see what you're trying to do. Maybe there's a way that you've failed,
right,
and maybe I can point you in another direction, but it being constructive in a way which mobilizes people, that some are polyamorous and some are not. And you can say, yeah, we're on this, all in this together. And I know that sounds like cheap right-wing rhetoric, right? But that's what the left needs.
Yes and no. I mean, I guess with polyamory, I think my issue is that it has already gone to, I think you're absolutely right to ask that question. And I do want to sort of return to a history of polyamory, consequently, perhaps, in a more concerted way, to see how did it get implanted in various communities? What was it fighting against? As you point out, as you say, as a tool within the structure for left-wing politics. What I saw, and I continue to see, unfortunately, with polyamory, and this may also, so what you're making me think about is something that we talked about earlier, right? Which is the difference between urban centers and suburbs and rural areas. So it might, I think there's then a possibility that within semi-rural suburban areas, right, the possibilities were different, and that when it's transplanted, because what I'm looking at is what's been transplanted, particularly in urban areas, right, where it's become a kind of a showcasing, it's become like a card you use to signal your left politics without actually. So for instance, one of the things I talk about in my polyamory is gay marriage piece is the fact that, some of them talk about housing, right? They'll say, oh, we all live in this house. But talking about radical left-wing politics, they use polyamory within that housing context to become more implicated in things like gentrification and to become more about the ownership of property, right?
Mm.
So there's a way in which polyamory helps to recover those things rather than fight against them.
Yeah.
But I do think that what you're saying, I think, persuades me to perhaps look at the origins of it and how it perhaps circulated in different places. But I will say that the problem with looking at that right now is often, and I think this is true of other movements as well, right? Like you could say that about gay marriage, etc., which is to say what could be done with this to disrupt and to bring about a left politics. I think the problem often is that by the time you reach a point, it's become so embedded in a non-left politics, for lack of a better term. But I do think that's a really interesting question to see. Perhaps does it even circulate? Perhaps I don't know.
Yeah, but for example, like gay marriage, for example, right?
Yeah.
I know a few friends that have got married because they think that it's a liberating thing for people. A couple of lesbians that I know from London got married, and I like, instead of just saying that, because I agree that you're right, that there's critique to be brought to bear on this, but it's not as if these people, in then becoming part of this homogenized world, which is part of sort of centric structures, that wasn't what they intended by their marriage. That wasn't the symbolism behind it, and it's not the symbolism behind the people that become a polyamorous relationship and then come to own property in this certain way. So there's a way in which they failed, but there's a way in which they're trying to sustain something different. And it's important for those people to be, in a sense, allies in a way, and pointing out that the way that in which they've done something which they think is radical has fallen into this pattern of something else, not in a way which is, you're just an idiot. And I'm sure that your essay doesn't say that, but...
So, right. I see what you mean. So I will say that we've actually addressed that very directly as Against Equality. So we have said over and over again that I think one of the essays, one of the interviews where we do that is where we was with No More Potlucks, in an interview where we said, look, people marry for different reasons, and you can and you should marry for different reasons. Some people marry for love. Well, that's fine, right? Some people marry for immigration. If that's what you need, take it and run. Some people marry for money. If that's what you need, take it and run. Our critique of gay marriage has never been to say to people, individuals, you're idiots for doing this, right? Our critique has been, do what you must, do what you want, but fundamentally you have to acknowledge that politically gay marriage is a part of this extraordinarily repressive, horrible system. So, Ryan and I, maybe I should not be saying this out loud. Oh, what the fuck. Ryan and I have sort of semi-seriously talked about marrying for 101 different reasons, right? Our friends are married for various reasons, whether it's immigration or whether it's whatever the hell it is, because you need to keep the house in your name. I mean, there are 100 million. So we have never once, so we always separate that. As I just want to be clear about that, is our politics around gay marriage is not to be critical of what individuals do, but to say that we have to understand that the system that forces individuals to marry is a horrible system. The problem is that the system in which gay marriage is entrenched is a system that is brutal, is a system that excludes the unmarried, is a system that basically says you're worthless if you're not married. On a number of different levels, gay marriage operates that way. So that's always been our politics, and that's been my politics, and I know that's been Ryan's politics. So it's not about, and a lot of people who are married, I can't tell you how many straight people have come up to me after Against Equality published this critique. I've lost count of how many straight people came up to me and said, I only got married for healthcare, and I hated that. I don't know what it's like elsewhere, but in the United States, getting married is super easy, it turns out. I mean, for gay and straight people, but it turns out getting divorced, especially if you're a woman, is hell. I know a woman who said, she married a guy for healthcare. She married him so that he could have healthcare. The marriage emotionally, even she married her best friend kind of thing. Then about a year later, blah, 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 they decided to get divorced. It took her like 6 years to get divorced. It took her 1 day to get married. All they had to do was trip down to the courthouse. They got married. It took her 6 years. And she realized as she was in that process, she realized it had everything to do with the fact that she was a woman. It had everything to do with the fact that the state was looking at her and saying, you own property, you're a woman, we're not going to let you become an unmarried woman with properties. The minute she got married, her property became something else altogether, you see? So that's our point, is that people don't understand how marriage immediately cathects you, immediately sucks you into the system, which also has very gendered implications. Marriage is very different for women. Divorce is very different for women. So those are the power dynamics and the institutional problems that we're always trying to tell people. But I've been the wedding photographer for a friend of mine. So,
your point is really interesting, because you can see the Marxist critique behind what you're saying. Like, I think that I completely missed that the first time that you were talking about it. And I think that there's probably a very interesting interplay between the symbolic use of that, of the meaning of something versus the hegemonic effects of it within a culture.
Exactly.
And yeah, I think that the way that maybe you perceive the functionalism of it is very interesting, because even those spaces are kind of contested spaces at the moment about what it means to get married, because legalistically it means something which is tied to neoliberal policy, but then the people that are doing it are resisting that kind of form. So it's a very strange interplay where it can create a dichotomy where I say something which seems like I'm arguing with you, but in fact it's kind of the link is along different lines, and a fight that hasn't been finished yet, maybe.
No, it's a lot, and it's also history that has not been told, because I think whenever we conceive of social movements, we can only think of them as socialities being established, and we either don't want to, or we're not taught, or we're not allowed to think about what you call, the power of hegemony behind socialities, right? So what is the power behind marriage? What I find very interesting, for instance, in the UK, is that in your case, gay marriage was not necessarily tied to healthcare, because you guys already have what we yearn for. However, it's very fascinating to me that the gay marriage, if you look at the history of how gay marriage started to become a cause, right, with celebrities like Elton John pushing for it, is around the same time that you see a real attrition in the cause of the state of the NHS. That's not a coincidence. This is neoliberalism quietly coming along and nibbling, right, at the cake. It's sort of saying, you don't really need a national health service, do you? What if you were to marry, right? So I know that your system is much stronger. And I know, for instance, in Australia, certainly, when I told my friend Helen Razor about the gay marriage undercutting healthcare thing, which is what's happening here, right? She said, Australians would kill you before they gave up their healthcare. So that's not even an issue with gay marriage. So gay marriage operates, its functionality and everything else operates in a very different way in Australia. Because over there, apparently Australians are just never going to give up their healthcare system. That's just not even on the table on any ideological side. But it is interesting to me that the argument for gay marriage began to make its way upwards, right? Just as the NHS also. And I know that the problems for the NHS have been complicated, for one thing, but also have a much longer history than we might think about. But I just find that kind of weird, interesting neoliberal collusion, you know, I find that fascinating, that these things become conversations, louder conversations at around the same time, which is why I think there's a real need to be cautious about how we think about social movements. You know, if you think about immigration as a social movement, as just about giving people a place to be, then you forget that immigration in the United States, for instance, for the longest time was a conversation about labor. Then the undocumented queers come along and boom, no one is talking about labor anymore with immigration. There's not a word said about labor, which is bizarre, because right up to like 1999, and that was the big bone of contention for May Day, right? The labor people were going like, this is about labor. And the undocu-queers were saying, this is about undocu-queers and undocumented people. And labor kept saying, this is about labor. That conversation about labor and immigration got wiped out, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is that with all social movements, I think there's a way in which the ones that we have seen dominate the conversation in the last 20 to 30 years have succeeded to an extent only for certain people, precisely by erasing these very complicated nexus of power, of economics, of politics. They erase labor issues, they erase the ways of thinking about how this is a Marxist critique. This is also a feminist critique for the longest time. And this was a queer critique of marriage for the longest time, right? Like marriage, to use the old fashioned phrase, marriage is the slavery of women, is the enslavement of women to an institution. Marriage is prostitution, is a form of prostitution for women, if you take that word, in its valence from a long time ago. But it's still true. Those things are still true, but we've quietly erased those realities about what marriage means for women as opposed to men. And then with gay marriage, what gay marriage did, right, is it gendered people within a same-sex relationship. So one of the first New York Times articles about gay marriage, for instance, was about how a number of gay men, especially those in the upper and upper middle class to upper classes, a number of them were now choosing to give up their jobs because they decided amongst themselves that there needed to be one parent in the house looking after the children they were adopting from Guatemala. Yeah. That's like a weird, I was really like, where the fuck did we go back, into the 1950s again? What is all this about? Right? So gay men were now responsible for taking marriage back into the Stone Ages.
Yeah. The way that I would kind of see that though is that, like, I would respond to your first bit about the NHS with a little bit of caution. Like the way that I would see it would be that when gay marriage became a thing and the New York Post noticed that there were certain phenomena going on, you'd noticed how gay couples became gendered in a way that was heterosexual, in a traditional heterosexual. And that makes complete sense to me. The paradigms that they're using follow up within a certain thing. But I think that with the gay marriage in the UK and the NHS, the relationship would be one which would, I don't see necessarily the causality between that. It sort of presupposes a functionalism that might not necessarily be there with the UK, but like in regards to your other thing, I think that's completely correct. Yeah.
Well, I do think it's quite interesting in relation to that it was brought in by the Tories, though. I mean, it's kind of conjecture, I guess, but it was a conservative project in the UK.
Yeah, David Cameron, I think, was the one who first said, right, that gay marriage is totally important. It's a great conservative cause to rally around. And that's sort of what Republicans are now saying as well. They were resistant to it at first, but I think now it's all about, well, yes, it's good because it brings families together. But yeah, I remember I actually wrote about Cameron. But I take your point, Harvey. Yeah, to be cautious about too much, but there's just a lot, yeah, to think about and talk about there, right? Yeah.
No, I think we've been talking for, it's like half 12.
Oh, good Lord, yes. It's past midnight for you.
Yeah, I've got through a whole bottle of wine.
I think it's the longest one we've done.
Really?
It's great.
I've been loving it. I'm sure once I actually get my ass off this chair, I'll probably just keel over. I don't have to stand up anymore. Like, whoop.
And I was, when I was in Chicago, I was part of the disability movement, and I was kind of coming out as queer, and I was finding that I had all these gay elders who were involved in this disability movement who were very defensive when I was like citing. At the time, I was just finding out about Yasmin's work when I was a master's student, originally in Chicago in like 2014. And I had all these elders in the disability movement who were so upset that I was criticizing marriage, and so upset that how dare you, ask questions about these things. And it's such a great thing, and you should be so thankful for us for doing it for you. And I was like, what? Like, isn't the point of being gay, which is that's what I thought I was at that point in my life, isn't the point of being gay to not have to go along with those things? So it really wasn't about face for people, for kind of young people who are coming out. And Chicago also has this like queer punk movement. They have this queer hardcore movement. And so it's kind of a strange clash between that kind of values that you see in some places in urban centers, and this really HRC oriented thing. So it was really a clash. And when Yasmin talks about the sex that is not radical, that was like when I first engaged with her work, and I remember that fondly. It's a classic. So and that's like what, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, I don't know, at least 7 or 8. But so it really took the world by storm. I think a lot of people who weren't even aware of that debate weren't even I wasn't anti-capitalist at that point. I was still in this little nonprofit identity politics world. It really took the world by storm. So I'm glad that classic has gotten reasserted.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. This has been the Exploding Appendix podcast. If you like this and you'd like to check out more, visit our website at www.explodingappendix.com. Exploding Appendix, ideas and culture with guts. Sometimes the world's perfect, nothing to rearrange. Sometimes you just get a feeling like you need some kind of change. No matter what the odds are this time, nothing's going to stand in my way. The flame in my heart, like a long lost friend, gives every dark street a light at the end. Standing tall on the wings of my dream, rise and fall on the wings of my dream. The rain and thunder, the wind and haze, I'm bound for better days. It's my life, it's my dream, nothing's going to stop me now.